In the early 2000s, the town of Ashgrove sat tucked away between low hills and empty farmland, the kind of place where everyone knew one another's faces and secrets rarely stayed hidden. The town had only one grocery store, one school, and at the edge of it all stood an overgrown cemetery that children had been warned to stay away from. Adults called it unsafe, crumbling, and forgotten. For the younger ones, that only made it magnetic. The old headstones leaned at odd angles, their names fading into moss, and at the center of it all stood a towering mausoleum built of gray stone. No one alive could remember who it was built for. Its doors, iron and heavy, were chained shut, and its very presence seemed to dare kids to come closer. By the early 2000s, the cemetery had become a proving ground for what the teenagers in town called the graveyard games. The rules were simple. Meet at the cemetery after dark, split up, and race to touch the mausoleum doors before midnight. Sometimes it was just a test of courage, but other times, dares went further. Stay inside the grounds until the church bells rang, leave an offering on a cracked grave, or say your own name 3 times at the gates. The games were harmless to most. Parents complained, but they dismissed it as no different than kids telling ghost stories around a fire. But for 13-year-old Marissa Clayton, one night in October of 2002 would be different. Marissa was small for her age, with long brown hair and the kind of restless energy that kept her in motion. She was often described by friends as fearless, sometimes recklessly so. That night, she and 4 others snuck out, walking the mile stretch of gravel road that led to the cemetery. It was just after 10 p.m., and the air had the sharp bite of autumn. The boys dared each other first, circling the cracked fence line and hiding behind tombstones. They laughed, shoving one another, trying to mask their fear with bravado. But when it was Marissa's turn, she didn't hesitate. Witnesses later said she sprinted straight toward the mausoleum, her sneakers crunching leaves, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She looked over her shoulder once, smiling, before vanishing into the dark shadows that surrounded the stone structure. Minutes passed. The others waited for her laugh, her return, or at least the sound of her footsteps. But the silence stretched longer than anyone expected. They called her name, at first joking, then louder, their voices tinged with unease. Some thought she was hiding, trying to scare them. But when nearly half an hour passed without an answer, the fear became real. They gathered at the edge of the cemetery, too afraid to go closer, and debated whether to go in or run home. One finally sprinted back to town, banging on doors until adults came out with flashlights. By midnight, the cemetery was swarming with worried parents and neighbors calling Marissa's name. When she didn't answer, panic set in. By dawn, the sheriff's department had been called, and the search was treated as an official disappearance. Officers scoured the cemetery while locals stood at the gates, whispering theories. Some swore they'd always known the mausoleum was cursed, that something lived inside it. Others whispered about satanic rituals, a remnant of stories from the 1980s. One older neighbor insisted he had heard a scream carried on the wind that night, while another swore he saw lights flickering near the cemetery fence. The stories multiplied as fear spread, but when police combed the area, they found nothing that explained what happened. The other kids told investigators the same thing. Marissa had run ahead, laughing, and then she was simply gone. They never heard her cry out, never saw anyone else there. The only detail that stood out was that her flashlight beam disappeared near the mausoleum doors, as if it had been swallowed by the stone. The cemetery itself offered no clues, no footprints beyond hers, no signs of a struggle, no broken locks or open doors. Even the chained mausoleum seemed untouched. Officers tested the locks, finding them stiff with rust. It was as if Marissa had run toward the structure and then ceased to exist. The town held its breath in those first days. Parents kept their children inside. School assemblies were called to address the rumors, but the students whispered about it anyway. Some were convinced she had been kidnapped. Others believed she had found a way into the mausoleum and gotten trapped, while still others clung to the idea that the cemetery itself had taken her. The adults dismissed ghost stories, but even they couldn't explain how a girl could vanish in plain sight of her friends. By the end of the first week, search teams had expanded into the fields and wooded patches surrounding the cemetery. Helicopters circled overhead. K-9 units tracked her scent through the grass, only for it to stop at the base of the mausoleum. That single detail spread like wildfire, her trail ending at a structure that had been sealed for decades. For some, it confirmed the town's oldest fears about the cemetery. For others, it was the first sign that something human and sinister was at play. The sheriff gave interviews, assuring the town that every lead was being pursued, that foul play had not been ruled out. But as the days dragged on with no answers, people grew restless. A girl had vanished less than a mile from their homes, and the only witnesses were children. The cemetery gates were locked, posted with police tape, but that did little to calm the unease. At night, neighbors still claimed to hear things, echoes, faint cries, or footsteps across the gravel road leading to the graves. For Marissa's family, the silence was unbearable. Her mother clung to the hope that she had been taken and was still alive, somewhere beyond the town's borders. Her father spent nights walking the road, flashlight in hand, scanning the fields as if she might suddenly appear. But with each passing day, the fear deepened that the truth lay somewhere inside the cemetery they had all grown up ignoring. 16 years later, those whispers would prove to be more than superstition. But in 2002, in those first nights of searching, all the town of Ash Grove knew was that a 13-year-old girl had run laughing into the cemetery and never returned, leaving behind a silence that no one could explain. The search for 13-year-old Marissa Clayton began before dawn on a cold October morning. The cemetery where she was last seen had never been so crowded. Flashlights cut across the uneven ground, beams catching on tilted stones and casting long shadows that only heightened the sense of unease. Officers in dark jackets moved carefully, calling her name in low voices, while neighbors stood at the gates, whispering to each other, clutching coffee cups as if holding on to something solid would make the scene less unreal. What had begun as a dare between children was now an official missing persons investigation. Deputies stretched crime scene tape across the gates, creating a barrier between the anxious crowd and the search teams moving inside. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers giving sharp commands as the dogs sniffed the perimeter. The animals pulled toward the mausoleum again and again, whining and circling, but their trail ended at the base of the heavy stone doors. Investigators tested the locks and chains, confirming they had not been broken. No scratches, no pry marks, nothing to suggest the girl had gone inside. It was as if her presence simply stopped there, as abruptly as if she had been erased. By mid-morning, search crews had expanded their sweep beyond the cemetery. Volunteers joined in, walking shoulder to shoulder through nearby fields, combing the ditches along the gravel road, even checking the old barn foundations that dotted the outskirts of town. A helicopter circled overhead, its spotlight dragging across the landscape. Divers were sent to check the shallow river that wound past the town. Though no one could explain how Marissa might have reached it in the dark without leaving any tracks. Hours turned into a day, and still there was nothing. No clothing, no footprints beyond those already discovered, no discarded flashlight. The lack of physical evidence left investigators struggling for answers. When children go missing, the first hours are critical, and every expert on scene knew it. Yet here they were, with no clear direction to follow. The cemetery seemed unwilling to give up its secrets. Detectives began to consider other possibilities. Was it an abduction? Had someone been lying in wait that night, hidden among the stones, ready to snatch a child the moment she strayed too far? Or had Marissa herself chosen to run away, seizing the chaos of the game as her chance to slip into the night? The family dismissed the runaway theory immediately. Marissa's parents insisted she had been happy, close with her siblings, with no signs of trouble at home. Her teachers agreed. She was bright, restless, even mischievous at times, but she loved her family too much to vanish on purpose. That left darker theories, an abduction, or something tied to the mausoleum itself. Detectives turned to the only witnesses available, the other children who had been with her that night. Their accounts, however, only complicated things further. One boy swore he heard her scream just as she neared the mausoleum. Another said he thought she was laughing, her voice echoing strangely in the cold air. A girl who had been closest behind her admitted she wasn't sure. She thought Marissa had tripped or ducked behind a headstone, but when she called out, there was no answer. Each child offered fragments of truth, pieces that didn't quite align, leaving investigators with a puzzle that refused to fit together. The sheriff's department conducted the interviews repeatedly, hoping the details would sharpen with time. But children's memories are fragile, easily influenced by fear and by each other. Some began to second-guess what they'd seen, mixing what they'd heard from their friends with their own recollections. By the end of the second day, the stories had blurred into a haze of contradiction. The only fact everyone agreed on was this: Marissa had run ahead, laughing, and then she was gone. Meanwhile, whispers began spreading among the townspeople. Some pointed to the mausoleum, saying it had always been cursed, that no one should have been near it after dark. Others speculated about strangers passing through town, hitchhikers on the highway, or a predator who had chosen the cemetery as the perfect hunting ground. Parents clutched their children tighter, reluctant to let them out of sight, while neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. For a town so small, where everyone had grown up together, the sudden cloud of mistrust was almost as heavy as the grief itself. Search teams pushed on through the night, their flashlights sweeping over the same stones, the same patches of earth, as if repetition might force a clue to appear. Divers confirmed the river yielded nothing. Dogs brought back again and again to the mausoleum continued to stop in the same place, pawing at the earth before circling back in confusion. The frustration was palpable. Investigators wanted answers. The family wanted their daughter. But the cemetery remained silent. By the end of the first week, detectives had little to present beyond theories. The official report suggested two possibilities. Either Marissa had been taken by someone who knew the cemetery well enough to leave no trace, or she had slipped away intentionally, her disappearance coinciding with the chaos of the game. The first option implied a predator among them. The second contradicted everything her family knew about her. Neither brought comfort. As days stretched into weeks, the urgency of the search began to fade into a grim routine. Patrols continued, interviews were repeated, and the community held vigils in the town square, lighting candles and praying for her safe return. Yet every night, when the candles burned down and the crowd dispersed, the mausoleum still stood untouched, its chained doors glinting faintly in the moonlight. And for many in town, that image became the heart of their unease. A girl who ran toward it, laughter trailing behind her, and who was never seen again. 16 years later, that same mausoleum would give up the secret it had kept hidden. But in those early days of October 2002, all anyone had was the memory of a missing child, a trail that ended in stone, and the growing fear that something unspeakable had taken her away. As days turned into weeks, investigators knew they could not limit themselves to the boundaries of the cemetery. The trail had ended there, but the possibility that Marissa had been taken beyond those gates was one they could not ignore. Detectives began widening their search radius, combing wooded areas, abandoned houses, and barns on the outskirts of town. Deputies knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen unfamiliar vehicles or strangers passing through on the night she vanished. Tips trickled in, some hopeful, some bizarre. A farmer reported headlights near his property. A store clerk swore he had seen a girl matching Marissa's description traveling with a man in a pickup truck. Every claim was logged, investigated, and one by one discarded for lack of evidence. At the same time, detectives began to look closer at those within the community. In disappearances like this, they knew the explanation was often painfully close to home. They interviewed Marissa's family repeatedly, searching for any cracks in their stories, but none emerged. Her parents' grief appeared raw and genuine. They took polygraph tests, both passing without hesitation. Neighbors vouched for their character. Teachers spoke of their devotion to their children. If there were secrets within the Clayton household, investigators could not find them. Attention then shifted toward the cemetery staff. Rumors had already begun circulating about the groundskeeper, an aging man named Harold, who lived alone in a small trailer not far from the graveyard. He was a quiet figure, often seen tending the grass in the daytime and drinking alone in the evenings. The fact that he had keys to the gates and knowledge of the property made him an obvious subject of suspicion. When police brought him in for questioning, the town buzzed with speculation. Some whispered he had always been odd, others said he had once served time for assault decades earlier. Though his record was old and mostly minor, it was enough to fuel fear. Harold denied any involvement. He told investigators he had gone home before dusk on the night Marissa disappeared, that he had been watching television when the calls of panic first reached him. Detectives pressed harder, asking about his past, about his access to the mausoleum, about whether he had seen Marissa that night. He admitted to little beyond his routine. When given a polygraph, he passed. Searches of his trailer turned up nothing. For investigators, suspicion could not stand without evidence, and Harold was released. But in the court of public opinion, the rumors clung to him, and from then on he was watched with wary eyes wherever he went. Theories multiplied as official leads dried up. Some believed Marissa had been abducted by someone passing through, an outsider, a predator who knew the back roads and left before dawn. Others wondered if one of her friends knew more than they were admitting, if the conflicting stories about laughter and screams pointed to guilt or fear of punishment. Parents began pulling their children from the graveyard games, forbidding them from even walking near the cemetery. The once harmless dares had become tainted, no longer a rite of passage, but a reminder of a girl who had not come home. The cemetery itself took on a different character in the town's imagination. Before, it had been neglected, avoided because of its decay. Now, it was feared outright. Neighbors said they saw candles burning inside it late at night. Teenagers whispered that if you stood near the mausoleum for long enough, you could hear knocking from within. Parents dismissed such talk, but even they could not shake the unease. The mausoleum had become the face of the mystery, its chained doors a silent witness to Marissa's last known steps. Detectives were not immune to the pull of those rumors. They re-examined the mausoleum, checking its structure for hidden access points, tapping along its walls, lowering cameras into the ground around its base. But the structure revealed nothing more than old stone and rusted chains. Forensic teams swept its perimeter for signs of disturbance, but none were found. Still, the fact that her trail had ended there left investigators with the gnawing sense that they were circling something vital, something that remained just out of reach. As the months passed without answers, tension gripped Ashgrove. The school held assemblies on safety. Parents carpooled rather than letting children walk alone. A curfew, informal but widely observed, seemed to settle over the town. The police fielded countless calls from residents reporting suspicious activity, strange cars parked near the road, people wandering too close to the cemetery at night, shadows in windows. Most of it amounted to nothing, but each report carried the weight of fear, a reminder that trust in the safety of the community had been broken. By the end of that year, the case of Marissa Clayton was faltering. The sheriff's department admitted they had no strong leads. Theories of abduction, of a runaway, even of something darker rooted in superstition, were all considered, but none could be proven. The family's grief hardened into quiet endurance, their home marked by the absence of laughter once filled by their daughter. Her friends, still teenagers, carried the trauma of that night in silence, unsure how to explain what they had seen, or what they hadn't. The cemetery, meanwhile, stood unchanged. Grass grew higher around its stones, the chain on the mausoleum door rusting further as the years passed. To outsiders, it was just another burial ground. But to the people of Ashgrove, it was something else entirely, a reminder of the moment a child had vanished in plain sight, of suspicions that never resolved, and of a truth that seemed buried too deep to ever be uncovered. 16 years later, those suspicions would resurface with a vengeance, when the very ground beneath the mausoleum shifted and revealed what no investigation ever had. But in those first months, all that remained was dread, rumor, and a gnawing sense that the story was far from over. Months passed, and the urgency that had once consumed Ashgrove began to fade into something heavier, quieter, and far more permanent. In the first weeks after Marissa vanished, her face had been everywhere, on flyers taped to gas station windows, pinned to church boards, and plastered across telephone poles at every intersection. Volunteers had driven miles into neighboring counties, handing out her picture, stopping strangers, and asking if they'd seen a girl with long brown hair and a restless smile. But as winter came and went, the posters grew weather-worn, their corners curling, the ink bleeding until her features blurred. By the second year, only a handful remained, faded reminders of hope that was now slipping further away. Detectives continued their work as long as they could, but one by one, each lead fizzled out. A tip about a man in a truck who matched a composite sketch led to nothing but another dead end. A sighting at a highway rest stop proved false. Files thickened with statements, maps, and lists of suspects that eventually overlapped until no clear path remained. One investigator described it years later as trying to follow footprints in a storm. The harder they looked, the faster the trail disappeared. Without physical evidence, without a body, the case that had once consumed the entire county began to slow, the momentum drained by the weight of silence. The family clung to whatever they could. They appeared on local television once, holding back tears as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. They offered a reward they could barely afford. Neighbors helped them raise money with bake sales and charity events, but as the years dragged on, even those efforts dwindled. Hope was expensive, and in a town where people struggled to pay their own bills, the burden eventually became too heavy to share. The Claytons were left to carry it alone. By the third year, their interviews stopped. They no longer stood in front of cameras or answered reporters' questions. Their grief turned inward, the sound of it muffled within the walls of their home. In the vacuum left by evidence, other voices began to fill the silence. A traveling psychic came through town one summer, promising to help families of the missing connect with their loved ones. She claimed Marissa's spirit was still in Ashgrove, that she was trapped under stone. Some parents believed her, whispering that the mausoleum itself had claimed the girl, that her laughter still lingered in the cold air around it. Police dismissed the claims outright, refusing to put their resources into chasing what they called superstition. But for a grieving community desperate for answers, the psychic's words sank deep. The cemetery, once neglected, became feared in a new way, not just a place of decay, but a place where the living might touch the edge of the unknown. As the investigation cooled, the cemetery grew more desolate. Grass rose waist-high in the summer, weeds curled around the edges of cracked stones, and the wrought iron gates rusted until they moaned on their hinges. Families buried their dead elsewhere, leaving the grounds to wither in neglect. The only visitors were teenagers daring each other to enter after dark, or the occasional mourner who left quickly, unwilling to linger. And yet, despite its abandonment, people in the houses nearest to it began to tell stories. Some said they heard faint knocks echoing from within the mausoleum, too rhythmic to be the shifting of stone. Others claimed to hear dragging noises across gravel paths when no one was there, or faint cries that carried on the wind during nights when the town lay silent. These sounds were never recorded, never proven, and yet they became part of Ashgrove's folklore. Parents used them as warnings, telling their children not to wander near the gates, insisting it was too dangerous. But the stories traveled anyway. Teenagers whispered them in the halls of the school. Younger kids dared each other to run up to the mausoleum and press their ears to the chained doors. Some swore they felt vibrations from within, as though something alive was waiting in the dark. For the police, such rumors were a constant frustration. Detectives had exhausted every rational path, yet the community kept circling back to superstition. They knew a girl didn't simply vanish without human involvement, but with no evidence, no confessions, and no further witnesses, the case file began to gather dust in the archives of the sheriff's office. Officially, it was listed as unsolved. Unofficially, it had gone cold. The weight of that unresolved silence seeped into the town itself. Families who had once been close drew away from each other. Strangers were eyed with suspicion, but so were neighbors. The Claytons withdrew into their own grief, rarely seen outside except for work or necessities. Marissa's old friends grew up carrying the memory of that night like a scar, some of them leaving Ashgrove entirely, hoping to outrun what had happened there. But for those who remained, the cemetery was an ever-present reminder. Every drive past its gates stirred the same unanswered question. How could someone vanish so completely? By the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, no memorial was held. The family had stopped marking the day publicly, though those who knew them said the house remained unnaturally quiet. The town's attention had shifted, but the unease never left. Ashgrove's children grew up with the story of Marissa as a warning. Her name invoked the way others might speak of cautionary tales. And the mausoleum, its heavy doors still chained, remained at the center of it all. What was once a forgotten structure of stone and marble had become the town's most enduring symbol of dread, its silence louder than any grave. No one knew then that beneath that silence, beneath the very ground they avoided, the answers to every question had been waiting. And when a storm years later tore through Ash Grove, it would rip open the foundation of that mausoleum and reveal that the whispers of knocks, of dragging sounds and faint cries, had not been imagination at all, but echoes of a truth the town had never been ready to face. By the time the 2010s arrived, the memory of Marissa Clayton's disappearance had shifted from an active case to something closer to folklore. The cemetery where she was last seen had taken on a reputation that far outstripped its size. For the younger generation, too young to remember the frantic searches or the faded posters, the graveyard was no longer just a place of mourning. It was a test of courage, a rite of passage for those willing to flirt with fear. What had once been whispered about only in daylight became the backdrop of adolescent dares, carried out with phone cameras and posted online for proof. The challenges evolved into what local kids simply called the Mausoleum game. Groups of teenagers would gather at the gates just before midnight, their laughter brittle, their bravado masking unease. The goal was simple: reach the chained doors of the mausoleum, touch them, and return without flinching. Some added rules: stay there for a full minute, whisper Marissa's name, or shine a flashlight through the cracks. The more daring the stunt, the more likely it was to earn a shaky video upload that would be shared among classmates. Soon, those clips spread beyond Ash Grove, appearing on forums and early social media, turning a local tragedy into a kind of urban legend. Outsiders who had never set foot in the town began to recognize the mausoleum's weathered facade. But the game came with consequences. Neighbors living closest to the cemetery grew weary of the late-night trespassing. They reported hearing teenagers laughing in the dark, hearing locks rattled, and sometimes discovering broken chains on the gates. Police were called repeatedly, and though patrols tried to increase their presence, the dares continued. Every generation seemed determined to test themselves against the same structure that had become the symbol of loss. But it wasn't just vandalism or trespassing that unsettled the community. Strange reports began to filter in, details that went beyond the ordinary recklessness of youth. Some neighbors claimed to see flickering lights inside the cemetery when no one was there. Others described sudden bursts of cold air drifting across the street, even on warm nights, as though the ground itself exhaled. A handful of people swore they caught the scent of decay, sharp and unmistakable, carried on the breeze from a place where no new burials had taken place in decades. These reports rarely made it into official logs, dismissed as exaggeration or the product of fear. But in a town already haunted by what had happened years earlier, the details clung to the mausoleum's reputation, reinforcing its hold over the community's imagination. For those who remembered the original tragedy, it was painful to watch the story of Marissa shift into spectacle. Her disappearance, which had once torn families apart and filled the town with dread, was now becoming a legend told in half-truths and dares. To her family, it felt like a distortion of grief, a cruel reminder that the wound they carried had become entertainment for others. But they were powerless to stop it. Officially, the case remained unsolved. No arrests had ever been made. No new evidence had surfaced. And without answers, the mausoleum itself became the only enduring reminder, a stage upon which fear could play out again and again. Local police tried to contain the situation. They resecured the cemetery gates, installed brighter floodlights, and replaced the chains on the mausoleum more than once. Yet each attempt seemed temporary. The dares continued, the locks were broken again, and the whispers of strange phenomena never stopped. Officers admitted quietly that they hated patrolling the grounds after midnight, that even with flashlights and partners at their side, the air inside the cemetery felt wrong. They would leave with goosebumps, unable to explain why. Over time, Ash Grove found itself caught between two versions of the same place. By daylight, the cemetery was merely old and neglected, its stones chipped and its pathways overgrown. But at night, it became something else. An arena for fear, a magnet for curiosity, a place where the living came to challenge the silence of the dead. Parents warned their children to stay away, while those same children slipped through the gates in defiance, eager to prove themselves braver than the generation before. Each group told its own stories afterward, of whispers in the grass, of footsteps that didn't match their own, of the sense of being watched even when the cemetery appeared empty. The reputation of the mausoleum grew so pervasive that it began to overshadow the truth of the original case. To outsiders, the story of Marissa was just one thread in a larger tapestry of ghost stories, the details blurred, distorted by time and retelling. Some claimed she'd been dragged into the mausoleum by unseen hands. Others said her body had been buried beneath it. The lack of evidence only gave these rumors room to spread, and the structure's locked doors became a canvas onto which every theory could be projected. Still, for those who had lived through the search, there was no comfort in the supernatural. They knew that behind every flickering light and whispered tale was the cold reality of a girl who had vanished without trace, and as the years crept on, the weight of that truth became harder to ignore. No matter how many times the cemetery was turned into a stage for thrill seekers, the fact remained. No one had ever explained what happened to Marissa, and no one had ever brought her home. By the middle of the decade, the mausoleum stood as both warning and lure, its chains clinking softly in the wind, its silence heavy with meaning. To some, it was just stone and rust. To others, it was the town's darkest secret. And though the police had long stopped investigating, though the case files gathered dust in the archives, the mausoleum never let Ashgrove forget. 16 years after the night Marissa vanished, the structure would finally reveal what had been hidden all along. But in those years before, it was only legend, a legend that seemed to grow darker with every trespass, every rumor, and every whispered sound carried from the cemetery after midnight. 16 years had passed since the night Marissa Clayton vanished, and though her name had faded from headlines, it had never faded from Ashgrove. The cemetery still stood on the edge of town, its stones chipped and overgrown, its mausoleum still chained as it had been the night she disappeared. For years it remained only a symbol, locked in silence, until one summer evening, a storm tore through the county and changed everything. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in with a wall of dark clouds that split open the sky. Rain hammered the streets for hours, and the river that snaked past town swelled, spilling into fields and washing over roads. The cemetery, already old and neglected, took the brunt of the flooding. Its earth softened, its pathways disappeared under streams of water, and its aging foundations began to weaken. When the storm finally broke at dawn, neighbors ventured out to survey the damage. What they found at the base of the mausoleum left them shaken. The ground directly beside the structure had buckled, as if the earth had caved in on itself. Cracks ran like veins through the stone foundation, some wide enough to peer into. One man who lived across the road swore he heard something that night, booming noises mixed with what sounded like a hollow echo beneath the collapse, a space where solid ground should have been. To the neighbors who gathered at the gates, staring at the fractured earth, it seemed confirmation of what they had whispered for years, that something unnatural lay hidden beneath the mausoleum. Authorities were called in to assess the damage. At first, their concern was structural. The storm had weakened buildings all across the county, and they assumed the collapse was no more than erosion. The cemetery was roped off, the area around the mausoleum sealed under the explanation of safety. Engineers arrived to survey the cracks, measuring the tilt of the stone and marking areas too unstable to walk. But the more they studied the damage, the stranger it became. The collapse had not exposed solid earth, as expected, but something darker, an opening that led down into a cavity. Word spread quickly. Within a day, crowds gathered near the cemetery fence, trying to glimpse what lay beyond the yellow tape. Officials offered little explanation, saying only that the collapse had revealed a void under the mausoleum. Privately, however, some admitted it didn't look like erosion at all. The chamber had walls. The soil appeared cut away, shaped deliberately. It was no natural sinkhole. It was something constructed, hidden beneath the cemetery for decades, perhaps longer. Neighbors who had lived near the cemetery for years described their unease as something deeper than fear. For them, the sight of that hollow space was a vindication of everything they had whispered about since 2002. The knocks, the dragging sounds, the cries they swore they had heard late at night. They told reporters that the storm had not revealed something new, but rather had ripped open the skin of the ground, exposing what had always been there. Some claimed the air smelled foul when the collapse first appeared, like old rot released after being sealed for too long. For the sheriff's department, the discovery reopened old wounds. 16 years earlier, they had closed the gates of that cemetery, frustrated and empty-handed. Now, the earth itself was suggesting there had been more to the mausoleum than they ever imagined. Detectives who had once worked the case were called out of retirement, their names appearing on the rosters of those consulted for what came next. Some resisted, weary of reliving their failures. Others admitted they couldn't stay away, compelled by the chance to finally learn the truth about the girl who had disappeared before their eyes. The first step was safety. Crews built scaffolding around the mausoleum, bracing the cracked stone to prevent further collapse. Pumps drained the pooled water that had collected in the cavity, and ground-penetrating radar was brought in to map the size of what lay beneath. The results confirmed what many had feared. The void was not small. It stretched under the mausoleum in irregular shapes, large enough to stand in, and lined in ways that suggested construction. The chamber had been there for generations, yet no cemetery records mentioned it, and no living resident had ever known it existed. As officials debated what to do next, the community's anxiety grew. Some urged the area to be filled in immediately, the chamber sealed to prevent further erosion. Others demanded a full investigation, arguing that if a hidden structure existed beneath the mausoleum, then perhaps it held the answers to Marissa's disappearance and the whispers that had haunted the town for so long. The sheriff made the decision to proceed cautiously, calling in forensic teams to document the site before any restoration could begin. What had started as an inspection of storm damage had now become the first real lead in a case thought to be unsolvable. News outlets descended on Ash Grove, reviving Marissa's story in headlines that framed the discovery as a chilling twist in a mystery long thought forgotten. Interviews with neighbors filled the airwaves, their accounts of strange sounds and flickering lights suddenly treated with new gravity. Reporters described the collapse as if it were the cemetery itself confessing, giving up secrets that had been buried beneath stone for decades. Families who had once mourned in silence began calling the sheriff's office, asking if the void might explain the disappearances of other relatives whose cases had gone cold. For Marissa's family, the discovery was devastating. 16 years had not dulled their grief, only buried it beneath layers of silence, and now it was being ripped open again. They avoided the cemetery, avoiding the cameras, but their absence was felt in every conversation. Neighbors admitted privately that they didn't want to know what lay beneath the mausoleum, because knowing would mean confronting the worst possibilities of what had happened there. The sheriff's office announced that a formal excavation would begin within weeks, once safety protocols were in place. Forensic specialists, structural engineers, and archaeologists were all consulted. What had started as the aftermath of a storm had now become a crime scene. And though no one could say yet what would be found, the tension in Ash Grove was undeniable. The town that had lived with silence for 16 years was about to hear answers. And when crews finally went beneath the mausoleum, what they uncovered would confirm that the storm had not just destroyed stone, it had torn open the past, revealing a secret more horrifying than anyone had been ready to face. The excavation beneath the mausoleum began cautiously, every step taken as if the ground itself might betray them. Heavy equipment was kept at a distance, replaced by careful hand tools, shovels, and brushes. Forensic teams moved slowly, documenting each crack and fracture in the stone before daring to disturb what lay below. The cavity exposed by the storm had already suggested something deliberate, something built with intention. Now, as investigators widened the opening, that suspicion was confirmed. Beneath the mausoleum was not solid earth, nor a natural sinkhole as some had hoped, but an entrance to a concealed chamber. The air that rose from it was stale and sour, carrying the unmistakable smell of age and neglect. When the first investigator lowered himself inside, his flashlight beam cut through darkness that had been undisturbed for decades. What it revealed was not a foundation, but a room, a space carved and lined with stone, sealed long ago, and never marked on any cemetery records. The chamber was cramped, its walls damp, the ceiling low enough that those inside had to stoop. Along one side, wooden partitions had been erected, crude and uneven, creating the sense of makeshift stalls or enclosures. Their planks were warped with rot, nails rusted to the color of dried blood. In the corner sat a rusted cot, its thin metal frame collapsed under the weight of time, its mattress reduced to scraps of fabric clinging stubbornly to springs. Nearby, investigators found fragments of clothing, small scraps that once belonged to children, a faded sleeve, a torn shoelace, a button still clinging to a shred of cloth. The scene froze the team in silence. It was no burial chamber, no forgotten annex of the cemetery. It was a place of concealment. Someone had used this space, hidden it, and left behind evidence that was impossible to dismiss. Each artifact was bagged carefully, photographed under harsh light, while officials above ground debated how to release the news to the town. They knew what they had found was bigger than one child's disappearance. When word finally reached Ashgrove, the impact was immediate. The discovery was treated not as a breakthrough, but as a collective wound torn open. Crowds gathered at the cemetery gates again, just as they had 16 years earlier. But this time, there was no hope for a missing child's return. Instead, there was outrage, fear, and speculation. If such a chamber had existed all along, sealed and hidden beneath the mausoleum, then someone in the town had known. Someone had built it, or at least maintained it, and kept it from every map, every record, every curious eye. The sheriff's department was flooded with calls. Some demanded to know whether Marissa had been found, whether her remains were among the evidence. Others wanted to know who had been responsible, who in their community had lived alongside such horror without ever speaking of it. The investigators, however, were not yet ready to give answers. They admitted only that the chamber existed, that it had been hidden, and that they were treating it as a crime scene. Beyond that, silence. Inside the chamber, every detail was logged. Soil samples were collected. The partitions were dismantled board by board, their splinters examined for traces of blood or hair. The cot was removed, its rusted frame carried into evidence vans under heavy tarps. The scraps of fabric, though degraded, were preserved, each one compared against old records of missing children in the region. Detectives worked alongside forensic anthropologists, hoping to uncover anything that might identify who had once occupied this underground room. The implications spread through town faster than official updates ever could. In diners, in church halls, on front porches, neighbors pieced together their own theories. Some believed the chamber had been built as part of the mausoleum itself, a secret crypt meant for burials that were never recorded. Others believed it had been repurposed by someone darker, used as a place to hold victims where no one would think to look. For the first time since Marissa's disappearance, people began speaking openly again about suspects, revisiting old suspicions about the groundskeeper, about strangers who had passed through town, even about families who had lived too close to the cemetery for comfort. The discovery reignited memories the community had tried to bury. Parents who had lost children in earlier decades, their cases unsolved, began to wonder if the chamber could explain their grief as well. Reporters returned to Ashgrove, turning its quiet streets into a backdrop for speculation. The cemetery, already infamous, was now broadcast on national television as the site of a hidden crypt tied to a girl's disappearance. What had once been whispered folklore had now hardened into evidence. For Marissa's family, the unearthed chamber was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. 16 years of silence had been punctured, but not with the answers they had prayed for. The artifacts, especially the small clothing fragments, were impossible to ignore. Were they hers, or had someone else's child been trapped down there before her? The possibility that Marissa had not been alone in her fate deepened the anguish, suggesting a pattern, a cycle that had claimed more than one victim. Investigators pressed deeper into the chamber, widening their search, probing into every corner for hidden compartments. What they uncovered suggested that concealment had been deliberate, carefully maintained. Drainage channels appeared to have been carved to prevent flooding, and the entrance sealed in a way that would mask its existence for decades. Whoever had built or used it had planned for longevity, ensuring that it would remain undiscovered unless the earth itself betrayed it. By the end of that summer, one fact was undeniable. The chamber had changed everything. The disappearance of Marissa Clayton could no longer be seen as a tragic mystery of a single night. It was part of something larger, something hidden beneath the very place where she was last seen. And though no body had yet been confirmed, the chamber's existence told the community that her fate had not been random. It had been concealed, intentionally buried beneath stone. The excavation was far from over, but already the discovery had shifted the question. It was no longer just, what happened to Marissa? Now the town of Ashgrove was forced to ask who among them had known this chamber existed and how many secrets still lay sealed beneath the mausoleum. When investigators pushed deeper into the hidden chamber, the discoveries turned from unsettling to horrifying. What had first appeared to be scraps of fabric and a rusted cot was only the surface of something far darker. As forensic anthropologists carefully sifted through the damp soil and debris, bones began to emerge. At first, a fragment of a rib, then the curve of a jaw, then long bones laid out in ways that could not be mistaken for anything but human. The chamber was not empty. It had been filled, over time, with the remains of children. The silence inside the space was described later as unbearable. Every movement of the trowels and brushes revealed more fragments, more evidence of lives cut short. Soon it became clear that these were not the remains of one person, but of many. Some bones were brittle, yellowed with age, suggesting they had been there for decades. Others were fresher, still holding traces of marrow. It was not a burial site in the traditional sense, but a place of concealment, where bodies had been hidden away from the world above. Among the skeletal remains, one discovery froze the entire team. In the corner of the chamber, partially buried beneath loose soil, lay the small frame of a child, whose bones appeared far newer than most. Around her wrist was a thin bracelet, its metal dulled by age but still recognizable. Investigators documented it immediately, photographing it against evidence markers. Later, when shown to the family, Marissa's mother confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The bracelet was her daughter's. She had worn it every day, a simple silver band with a small charm shaped like a star. The charm was still there, caked in soil, but undeniable. The chamber had answered the town's 16-year-old question, but the answer was worse than anyone had expected. Marissa had not simply vanished in the night. She had been taken into this underground room, hidden away beneath the very place her friends had last seen her. And she had not been alone. The presence of multiple sets of remains suggested that her case was not an isolated tragedy, but part of something systematic. Whoever had used the chamber had done so for generations, leaving behind a timeline of horror hidden in plain sight. Forensic experts cataloged the remains meticulously, separating bones by age and condition. Some were clearly children, others adolescents, but no adults were found. Clothing scraps confirmed this pattern: small shoes, tiny buttons, and torn shirts that could only have belonged to the young. The evidence suggested that the chamber had been a holding place, perhaps even a prison, before ultimately becoming a grave. The wooden partitions that lined the space now seemed less like storage and more like cells, crude dividers meant to keep children apart. The revelation shook Ashgrove to its core. News outlets described the discovery as a nightmare uncovered beneath sacred ground. Headlines declared the cemetery a crime scene spanning decades. Theories exploded. Had a single person used the chamber across generations, or had it been passed down like a family secret? Were these crimes the work of one disturbed caretaker, or was there a broader network of silence that had allowed it to continue? The lack of records about the mausoleum's foundation became its own scandal. How could such a structure exist without anyone in authority knowing? Neighbors who had long reported strange sounds near the mausoleum felt both vindicated and horrified. The knocks, the dragging noises, the faint cries they swore they had heard. Now, in hindsight, they seemed like echoes of real suffering, sounds seeping up from beneath the earth. Parents in town felt the weight of guilt for ever dismissing those stories as imagination. Some admitted privately that they had heard things themselves, but had convinced themselves it was the wind or stray animals, anything but what it truly was. The discovery of Marissa's remains closed the mystery of where she had gone, but it opened a wound far deeper. Her disappearance was no longer a singular tragedy. It was evidence of something methodical, carried out across time, hidden beneath the community's feet. The revelation turned suspicion into rage. People demanded to know who had built the chamber, who had used it, and how many others in town had been complicit through silence or ignorance. For investigators, the next steps were clear but grim. Every bone had to be tested, every scrap of fabric examined, every artifact cataloged. They brought in experts from state agencies, expanding the scope of the investigation far beyond Ashgrove. DNA testing was ordered both to confirm Marissa's identity and to attempt to match other remains to missing persons cases in the region. For families who had lost children in decades past, it offered a possibility of long-awaited answers. For others, it meant reopening wounds that had scarred over but never healed. The town itself recoiled from the cemetery. The site was sealed off completely, guarded day and night by deputies. The once neglected grounds now bristled with floodlights and evidence tents, the mausoleum standing above it all like a monument to secrets. Residents drove past quickly, refusing to look too long. Children were warned never to speak of it, though the truth had already spread through whispered conversations in hallways and classrooms. Ashgrove had lived with a mystery for 16 years, but what had been uncovered beneath the mausoleum was worse than any ghost story they had ever imagined. For Marissa's family, the confirmation of her death was both closure and devastation. The bracelet left no room for doubt. Their daughter's fate had been sealed long ago, buried just feet from where her friends had last seen her alive. But the knowledge that she had been only one among many shifted their grief into something heavier. She had been caught in a cycle that predated her, one hidden by silence and cement. Her life, her laughter, had been extinguished in the same place that had extinguished others before her. The chamber beneath the mausoleum was no accident of history. It was deliberate, a space built and used for purposes no one in Ashgrove wanted to imagine. And though Marissa's remains had finally been found, the town realized this was not the end of a tragedy, but the beginning of reckoning with the horrors that had been hiding beneath their cemetery all along. Once the shock of the chamber's discovery settled, investigators began pulling at the threads of history, determined to understand how something so elaborate could exist unnoticed for so long. Their first stop was the cemetery's own records, a collection of handwritten logs and faded maps stored in the county archives. What they found immediately raised suspicion. Whole sections of burial entries were missing. Decades-long gaps appeared in the ledgers, names of the deceased that should have been recorded but weren't. Some maps had entire plots erased, lines of ink scrubbed until the paper tore. It was clear someone had tampered with the history of the cemetery itself, stripping away any evidence that might have pointed to what lay beneath the mausoleum. Attention quickly turned to the family who had once served as caretakers of the cemetery. For generations, one family had lived on site in a small stone cottage at the edge of the grounds, their role passed from father to son. Old records confirmed their presence dating back to the 1940s, and while most townsfolk remembered them only as quiet and reclusive, darker rumors had always circulated. Some said madness ran in their bloodline, that isolation on the cemetery grounds had warped their minds. Others whispered about children being warned to avoid the cottage, that strange sounds were heard at night. But in a town eager to avoid its own superstitions, those warnings had been dismissed. Investigators began piecing together timelines, cross-referencing the known cases of missing children in the region with the years the caretaker family had been in charge. What emerged was chilling. From the 1970s onward, disappearances, rare but devastating, seemed to trace back toward Ashgrove. A missing boy from a county fair in 1978, a girl who vanished on her walk home from school in 1985, another teen last seen near the cemetery in 1991. None had ever been solved. Now, with bones uncovered beneath the mausoleum, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The strongest suspicion fell on one descendant in particular, a man named Samuel, who had taken over caretaker duties in the late 1980s and remained in charge until his death in 2004. Samuel had lived alone in the cottage, unmarried, known to be eccentric and prone to violent outbursts in town. Police had responded to complaints of trespassers and vandalism at the cemetery during his tenure, but none of those reports had led to formal charges. Locals remembered him as an intimidating figure, wandering the grounds at night with a lantern, shouting at children who strayed too close. Some now wondered if his vigilance had been less about protecting graves and more about guarding what lay beneath them. Though Samuel had been dead for years, the evidence tied his legacy to the crimes. The chamber's construction appeared old, but its use stretched well into the years when he was alive. Forensic dating placed some of the remains between the 1980s and early 2000s, exactly when he held control over the cemetery. And among them was Marissa, the last known victim, her disappearance aligning perfectly with his final years as caretaker. Ashgrove was forced to confront an unthinkable truth. The mystery had not been the work of strangers, nor of the supernatural forces people whispered about. It had been carried out by someone who lived among them, who walked their streets, who buried their dead. A man entrusted to guard the resting place of their loved ones had instead turned it into a prison. And though he had long since passed, the chamber he left behind remained, a monument to crimes that had stretched across decades. The final confirmation came quietly, delivered not in whispers or rumors, but in the cold language of science. DNA analysis matched one set of remains to Marissa Clayton. The bracelet her mother had described so many years earlier was more than a clue. It was proof. 16 years after she had run laughing toward the mausoleum and never returned, the truth was undeniable. Marissa had been there all along, sealed beneath the stone, hidden in a chamber no one had known existed. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide, yet the exact method remained uncertain. Time and decay had stripped away the evidence of how her life had ended, leaving only fragments of bone and a bracelet as testimony. There were no fingerprints to trace, no clear weapon to identify. The cause of death was marked as undetermined, but the intent was unmistakable. She had not wandered away, and she had not been lost to chance. She had been taken, confined, and hidden. The chamber beneath the mausoleum was sealed permanently after the investigation concluded. Authorities reinforced the ground, closed the site, and declared it off-limits. But sealing it did not erase its presence. For the people of Ashgrove, the mausoleum could never again be seen as stone and marble. It was a scar carved into their town, its weight pressing down even after the doors were locked and the ground covered. Neighbors who had once dismissed strange sounds as superstition now looked back with unease. The knocks, the dragging noises, the faint cries that people swore they had heard in the years after Marissa vanished, those sounds no longer seemed like imagination. They were interpreted instead as echoes of the children who had been trapped below, their suffering reverberating through the stone, carried into the night. The town, which had once mocked such stories as ghost tales, now avoided them in silence. No one laughed at the rumors anymore. Marissa's family received her remains in a simple wooden box. The funeral, held quietly, was attended by neighbors who wept not only for her, but for the years stolen by uncertainty. 16 years of wondering had been replaced by certainty, but certainty brought no peace. Her mother clutched the bracelet as if holding her daughter's hand one last time, her grief as raw as it had been the night she disappeared. Closure, people said, but the word rang hollow. The truth had not brought relief, it had brought horror. The case became part of Ashgrove's permanent history, the kind that no one wanted to remember, but no one could forget. Teachers warned students about it, parents used it as a cautionary tale, and investigators across the state cited it as proof of how secrets could hide in plain sight. The cemetery, once a place of dares and legend, became a place avoided at all costs. Even in daylight, the mausoleum's shadow seemed darker, heavier, its silence unbearable. What was found beneath it was not just Marissa, it was proof of a predator who had haunted Ashgrove for generations. A reminder that evil can root itself quietly, hidden in the very ground a community trusts. The storm that revealed the chamber had ripped open not just stone, but the truth that beneath their cemetery had existed a system of concealment, one that claimed children for decades. And though the mausoleum was sealed, the memory of what it had hidden would never fade. 16 years later, the legend of the girl who vanished during the graveyard game was finally explained. But the answer was not supernatural, nor was it a mystery that could be forgotten with time. The truth was darker, more human, and more enduring than any ghost story. And that truth left behind a terror the people of Ashgrove would carry forever.